What if the reason we haven't found alien life isn't because we're looking in the wrong places, but because we fundamentally misunderstand what matter itself is made of?
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to the debate. Usually when we try to picture life on other planets, we sort of act like cosmic interior designers.
Right, yeah.
We look at a blank environment and we just rearrange the furniture of our own terrestrial familiarity.
We absolutely bring our own blueprints. I mean, in biology, we just assume you need an oxygen-rich atmosphere, you need a certain proximity to a yellow dwarf star.
Right, exactly.
And you need a specific type of atmospheric pressure just to sustain a metabolism.
Yeah.
We really like our biological models to strictly follow the rules of the house we already live in.
Because it's comforting.
Of environmental determinism, suddenly you are trying to build that biological house in a completely alien void.
Oh, yeah, you're out in the deep end.
You really are, and today we're looking at a framework that asks us to do exactly that. So we are examining Daniel Petherbridge's 2010 manuscript. It's called A Theory of Environmental Evolution.
The ones.
The ones, right.
Yeah, and this document, it proposes a highly detailed, comparative evolutionary framework. It basically maps human biological adaptations here on Earth directly against the theoretical physiology of extraterrestrial entities.
The entities which the text refers to as greys.
Right, the greys. And it is a fascinating document. It is the absolute definition of theoretical muddy waters. I'll say that.
It is incredibly radical. I mean, the central question we are exploring today is this. Does Petherbridge's framework present a scientifically robust and logically cohesive model of environmental determinism when applied to exobiology? Or do its underlying biochemical contradictions and its really radical subatomic axioms render it fundamentally incompatible with empirical evolutionary science?
Right.
I will be arguing that this manuscript provides a highly elegant, logically consistent structural model that maps environmental inputs directly to physiological outputs.
Okay. And I will be arguing that while the model is undeniably ambitious, it ultimately relies on completely unworkable biochemical contradictions. And furthermore, I think it completely abandons biological science entirely with its underlying subatomic premise. This idea of a unified consciousness.
Well, let's dive into it. Let's establish the baseline the manuscript uses first, because I actually think the internal logic here is quite brilliant.
Okay, lay it out.
So Petherbridge starts with human biology on Earth, right? He uses us to show how environmental inputs dictate physiological outputs. He describes our specific environment as having and I'm quoting here, a tight, double-arrow orbital proximity with a large stellar host.
Which, in simpler terms just means we are relatively close to a massive energy source.
Our sun, yeah.
Right, our sun. And our orbit keeps us locked in a very specific high-energy thermodynamic relationship.
Exactly. And so, what does that high-energy input yield biologically?
Well, a lot of things.
Right, but according to the text, it yields small eyes with minimal pupil dilation.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is so much ample light, our biology leaves physical space for retinas and corneas to optimize for broad color spectrums, right, rather than just desperately gathering photons.
Right, we don't need giant lenses just to see in the dark.
Exactly. Plus, we have abundant vitamin D from that solar radiation, which facilitates the growth of hair, eyebrows, eyelashes, and, keratin for nails.
Sure.
We also have a very active cardiovascular system that's fueled by atmospheric oxygen, and that gives us a fully developed muscular physique.
Okay, I mean, it establishes a very clear baseline. I will certainly grant you that. It maps the cause and effect of terrestrial evolution pretty accurately.
Right, and here is where I think the elegance of the deterministic model really shines. By flipping those exact environmental variables, Petherbridge creates a perfectly correlated theoretical physiology for the gray.
The exact inverse.
The inverse, yeah. So if you place a subject in what he calls an expansive orbital loop around a smaller stellar host with little to no atmosphere—
a completely different thermodynamic reality.
Exactly. The adaptive outputs mirror the inputs flawlessly, so the eyes develop seemingly total pupil dilation to absorb the maximum available light from that distant smaller sun.
Right.
The skin becomes a neutral, hairless gray due to, as he puts it, severe vitamin D deficiency and an absence of seasonal weather cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And the physique becomes slender, with less apparent appendages, because there is an absolute absence of atmospheric oxygen to fuel heavy blood flow and muscle growth. It is a cohesive, totally symmetrical model.
Well, look, I acknowledge the structural symmetry. I really do. It is aesthetically pleasing to look at a chart and see perfectly inverted variables.
It makes logical sense.
It makes mathematical sense? Maybe. But true evolutionary theory cannot just be a mirror image extrapolation, You have to look at the viability of the underlying biological mechanics.
Okay.
And that is exactly where this framework shatters, in my opinion.
You're referring to the metabolic pathways, I assume.
Yes, specifically the metabolism. The manuscript claims that the theoretical grays have a slender physique and reduced appendages due to a lack of atmospheric oxygen.
Right.
But then, literally in the exact same section, it asserts that their sustenance is, and I'm quoting, derived photosynthetically, like plants, trees, or sea anemones.
Yeah.
You cannot propose photosynthesis in an environment explicitly defined by a smaller sun, an expansive orbital loop, and a total lack of atmosphere. It doesn't make any sense.
Look, I get it. If you're listening to this and wondering how on earth an organism can photosynthesize in the dark without an atmosphere, you're not alone. I had the exact same reaction initially.
Because it defies basic chemistry.
Well, on Earth, yes, but I think we have to view this through an analogical lens.
See, I come at it from a completely different way. Because words in scientific frameworks, they have to mean something specific.
Sure, but
Now take the manuscript's explanation for the gray skin, for example. It attributes their neutral, hairless skin to a severe vitamin D deficiency.
right.
That is a massive terrestrial anthropocentric bias.
How so? How is that a bias?
Because a species evolving in a wide orbital path around a small sun wouldn't be deficient in a terrestrial hormone that its biology never utilized in the first place.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Right? Calling it a deficiency implies they are broken Earth organisms rather than perfectly adapted alien ones. Furthermore, an absence of a catalyst doesn't just result in a blank slate.
Okay, explain that.
Evolution fills the void with a different active adaptation. It wouldn't just be neutral skin. It would be skin highly specialized to block cosmic radiation in an airless environment. It would utilize entirely different biochemical pathways. It wouldn't just be a lack of Earth stuff.
I see why you'd look at it that way, I really do. But consider the alternative perspective here. I don't believe Petherbridge is suggesting they are broken Earth organisms.
Then why use the word deficiency?
I think the term vitamin D deficiency is just being used as a structural anchor. It's a way to explain the absence of terrestrial traits to a terrestrial reader.
A metaphor, essentially.
Kinda, yeah. Let's look at how it works on Earth. Our varied climates and our 4 distinct seasons, from Africa to Alaska, as the text notes, those things drive dynamic adaptations.
Absolutely.
It's the shifting environmental stress that forces the evolution of, say, dark skin pigmentations in high UV areas or heavy keratin growth in cold areas.
Right. Physical responses to physical stress.
Right. So Petherbridge is positing that the complete absence of these seasonal cycles, the absence of varied solar radiation, inherently leads to a static, uniform morphology. The deficiency isn't a medical pathology for them. It's just a mechanical explanation for why the varied terrestrial morphology we see here didn't trigger over there.
But again, this brings us right back to the photosynthesis argument.
Okay.
You can't just borrow terrestrial mechanisms and apply them to an environment that explicitly forbids them. Photosynthesis on Earth relies on abundant photonic energy and specific atmospheric carbon availability.
Right.
Claiming an organism relies on photosynthesis in an environment starved of light and air, it just reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of metabolic requirements.
Okay, you're hitting on the exact reason why this theory is so controversial. But let's dive into the mechanics of alternative metabolisms for a second, because I think there's a workaround here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Consider deep-sea organisms right here on Earth. Like, think about the Marianas Trench.
Oh, sure.
Thousands of feet below the surface, you have completely zero light, mostly oxygen-deprived environments.
Crushing pressure.
Crushing pressure, exactly. Yet you have thriving ecosystems down there.
Right, because of chemosynthesis.
Exactly. chemosynthesis. You have yeti crabs and tube worms that don't rely on the sun at all. They absorb toxic hydrogen sulfide from hydrothermal vents.
Right.
And symbiotic bacteria in their bodies convert that chemical energy into sustenance. They bypass the traditional atmospheric, light-driven model entirely.
They do.
So when the manuscript says the grays derive sustenance photosynthetically, couldn't that just be shorthand for a similar ambient energy conversion?
I don't know if I can make that leap.
Well, wait. The text specifically says they derive sustenance like plants, trees, or sea anemones. Think about a sea anemone. It doesn't have a vascular system like ours. It absorbs nutrients directly from its ambient environment.
Mm-hmm.
If we view photosynthetic as an analogy for an organism absorbing ambient cosmic radiation directly, which perfectly matches their low muscular, low energy physiological structures, the model holds up beautifully.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
When you start having to translate the core mechanisms of a scientific theory into shorthand or metaphor just to make them physically possible, the theory itself is failing.
You think it's too loose of an interpretation?
With environment, and it needs dissolved oxygen to survive. It absorbs, yes, but it absorbs physical matter from a saturated medium.
Right.
It doesn't live in an airless void. If the manuscript meant ambient cosmic radiation conversion, it should have outlined the mechanics of ambient cosmic radiation conversion.
So you want the math.
I want the science. Instead, it relies on a terrestrial biological mechanism that fundamentally contradicts the thermodynamic inputs of a distant orbit and a small star.
See, I think you are holding a theoretical framework to the strict empirical limitations of Earth-based biochemistry.
I am holding it to the limitations of thermodynamics and metabolic logic, which are universal. But honestly, none of these biological arguments even matter if the fundamental building blocks of this proposed universe don't allow for biology in the first place.
Ah, okay. I know where you're going with this.
Which is exactly what Petherbridge's subatomic theory does.
You are referring to the fundamental subatomic foundation outlined at the bottom of the comparative charts.
I am absolutely referring to that. The text explicitly states, right beneath the biological and orbital diagrams, that the entire framework operates on a singular foundational premise. And I quote, "Keep in mind this is based on everything being frozen neurons and electrons."
Which I honestly think is perhaps the most profound synthesis in the entire 2010 manuscript.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No, really. He is offering a unified consciousness and matter theory.
It's metaphysical panpsychism. That's what it is.
Well, let's clarify that term for the audience for a moment. Panpsychism is essentially the idea that consciousness, or a mind-like quality, is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of all physical matter.
Exactly. And while it has a long history in philosophy, it collapses the theory's biological credibility entirely.
Why?
Because by redefining physical form and matter as static, structured arrangements, what the text literally calls frozen states of information-conducting components, the manuscript effectively abandons the principles of natural selection.
I don't think it abandons them, it just...
Evolution is a kinetic, dynamic process. It is driven by random mutation, reproduction, and the harsh sieve of physical environmental pressure over time.
Yes, on Earth.
Everywhere. The manuscript explicitly calls its subatomic foundation a structural state where these neural components are frozen. How does a static arrangement of frozen neurons undergo genetic mutation to evolve a larger pupil? It doesn't make sense.
Okay, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are treating physics and consciousness as entirely separate domains.
They are separate domains.
But Petherbridge is proposing that intelligence isn't merely a byproduct of millions of years of biological trial and error. He's saying it is an intrinsic building block of universal matter itself. It exists right alongside electrons.
Okay, but how does it adapt?
To answer your question of how it evolves, think of it like a computer screen.
A computer screen.
Yes, the pixels themselves, think of them as the frozen neurons. They don't move or evolve or undergo kinetic friction, right?
Right.
They are locked in a grid. It's a static arrangement. But when the environmental input changes, say moving from a tight orbit around a large sun to an expansive orbit around a small one, the underlying software of this unified consciousness tells different pixels to light up.
Okay.
It shifts states. The organism didn't evolve through random genetic mutation over billions of years. It shifted physical states to process the new environmental data,
Oh, I see.
right? So the total pupil dilation of the gray, or the human muscular physique, they are simply macro expressions of that fundamental substrate reacting to the data of their respective stellar hosts.
That is a beautiful metaphor. It really is, but do you see what that does to the science?
It reframes it.
It destroys it. If the environment and the organism are fundamentally made of the exact same suspended, state-shifting neural matter, then the earlier comparative analysis about orbital proximity driving eye size becomes scientifically meaningless.
I completely disagree.
But you've removed the physical friction of environmental adaptation. In evolutionary biology, the software, to use your term, is written by millions of years of natural selection, creatures dying because they couldn't survive the environment.
Right.
If the system just seamlessly shifts states like a screen changing an image based on data input, you've removed the concept of survival altogether. You aren't describing biology anymore, you're describing an intelligent machine.
But why must structural state physics and evolutionary adaptation be mutually exclusive?
Because they describe fundamentally different realities.
But it still maps perfectly to the physical expressions we observe. In the human model, the text notes that our active cardiovascular systems are fueled by standard atmospheric oxygen and metabolic nutrition.
Yes, which is observable.
Right, that is standard observable physics and biology. Petherbridge is just anchoring that physical reality to a deeper subatomic truth. If the universe is fundamentally composed of information-conducting components, then an environment isn't just dead rocks and empty space interacting with a living organism. The environment and the organism are part of a unified, responsive structural state.
That's a very compelling philosophical argument, it is. But have you considered the complete loss of definitional precision here?
Meaning what?
Applying terms like evolution and biology requires testable physical mechanisms. We can test the human model, we can observe the chemical exchange of oxygen in the lungs, we can trace the ATP cycle in the muscles. We know exactly how that energy transfer works.
Right.
How do you trace the metabolic cycle of a frozen neuron?
Well, you might not trace it with a terrestrial microscope, but the macro results are the same.
But the mechanisms are what make it science. Once your framework relies on static, frozen neural matter acting as a cosmic anchor for everything from a star to a fingernail, it ceases to be a biological theory of environmental evolution. You lose the testable physical mechanics.
I think we just lack the tools to test it right now.
If a gray's lack of muscle is due to its expansive orbital loop processing different information into its frozen neural substrate, rather than a quantifiable lack of oxygen inhibiting cellular respiration, you aren't doing science anymore. You're writing cosmology.
See, I don't think it's fair to dismiss cosmology as distinct from ultimate biological truths. What Petherbridge has done in this manuscript is challenge the rigid separation of those disciplines.
By conflating them?
By connecting them. By connecting a cosmological axiom directly to two physical planetary system models, he forces us to ask if our current definition of biology is simply too narrow.
It is restricted to our atmospheric conditions because those are the conditions under which the biological mechanisms we are trying to extrapolate actually function. You cannot borrow the vocabulary of biology, terms like pupil dilation, vitamin D, and keratin,
Right.
and then completely discard the fundamental rules of biology when it comes to metabolism and subatomic physics. If the eyes are made of state-shifting frozen neurons, they don't have biological corneas to optimize for broad color spectrums. You can't have it both ways.
But I think the manuscript does have it both ways, precisely because it is building a bridge between the macro and the micro. It uses the vocabulary we understand to describe phenomena we haven't yet categorized.
A shaky bridge, if you ask me.
Well, let me summarize my position on this extraordinary document, because I know we are coming up on time.
Sure.
The 2010 manuscript offers a deeply intriguing synthesis of stellar dynamics, atmospheric conditions, and orbital radii. By mapping these specific variables against human traits and then inverting them to map against theoretical extraterrestrial traits, it provides a thought-provoking, cohesive model for adaptation.
And it caps this biological mapping with a daring unified field theory of matter and consciousness, suggesting that the very fabric of the universe is built to process and adapt to environmental information.
Okay, and to summarize my position, while the comparative charts provide an aesthetically pleasing symmetry,
The model is ultimately compromised by severe mechanical contradictions.
The photosynthesis specifically.
Yes, it relies on biological impossibilities, like low-light, airless photosynthesis in an expansive orbital loop. And it underpins all of this with a cosmological axiom of frozen neurons that completely dissolves the very principles of empirical, testable evolutionary science it claims to utilize. It is a fascinating piece of speculative cosmology, I'll give it that, but it fails as a rigorous theory of biological environmental evolution.
Regardless of where one lands on the viability of frozen neurons or ambient energy conversion, I think we can both agree that this manuscript brilliantly illustrates the profound difficulty of theorizing alien life without projecting terrestrial biases.
Oh, absolutely. It shows how incredibly hard it is to untether our imagination from the specific gravity, the light, and the atmospheric pressure of Earth.
We just can't shake it.
We really can't. Even when trying to design an entirely alien entity operating on entirely different subatomic physics, the authors still reached for vitamin D and photosynthesis to explain it.
Yeah, it really forces a deeper understanding of our own planetary biology, doesn't it?
It does.
By pushing the boundaries of environmental determinism out into an expansive orbital loop around a smaller star, we are forced to articulate exactly why a tight orbit around a yellow dwarf produced us. The document's integration of cosmology and physiology, it leaves much more to be explored regarding how we define the very building blocks of life.
It certainly challenges the definitions we take for granted. I mean, every time we try to imagine what is out there, we end up learning quite a bit about what is down here.
We really do. We started this discussion by talking about building a house in a void. We usually rely on the terrestrial foundations we know, gravity, oxygen, sunlight. But when a theoretical framework like Petherbridge's tries to build that biological house out in the deep, dark expanse of a wide orbital loop, utilizing entirely new subatomic materials.
Like frozen neurons?
Exactly. Maybe the most important thing we learn isn't about the alien house at all. Maybe we just finally understand why we need the walls of our own house in the first place.
That's a great way to put it.
Until next time, thank you for listening to The Debate.